The first day, the glass doors of Crawford Enterprises opened with a hiss, and Riley stepped inside, clutching a tray with 2 cups of coffee. Her heart raced. It was her first day as the new secretary, and she was already late. The building was massive, cold, and intimidating. Everyone inside seemed to walk quickly, their faces stiff, their voices hushed. Riley had worked in other offices before, but nothing felt like this. Here, people moved as if they were always being watched, as if one mistake could end everything. And maybe it could, because at the top of this empire sat Maxwell Crawford, the millionaire CEO who ruled not just the company, but everyone inside it. Rumors followed him like shadows. Some said he fired people on the spot for minor mistakes. Others whispered that no one had ever seen him smile. His anger was sharp, his punishments legendary, and his presence alone was enough to silence an entire floor. Excuse me, Riley murmured nervously, weaving around employees who looked like they were trying not to exist. She wanted to make a good impression, which was why she had bought 2 coffees, one for herself and one for her new boss. She had no idea what he liked, so she chose something safe. But fate had other plans. As she hurried toward the reception desk, her left heel slipped on the shiny floor. The tray jolted. Both cups wobbled dangerously. Riley gasped, twisting to steady them. And at that very moment, a man appeared in front of her. Tall, broad shoulders, perfectly tailored suit. His eyes sharp like cold steel. Maxwell Crawford himself. The world seemed to stop. Every voice in the reception area fell silent. Even the clicking of keyboards and the shuffle of papers froze. Riley's arms flailed, but it was too late. The 2 cups of coffee lifted into the air, spinning almost in slow motion. A perfect arc carried them forward, until, splash. The hot liquid exploded across Maxwell's crisp white shirt and expensive tie. A $1,000 suit ruined in an instant. Gasps filled the room. Riley's heart stopped. Maxwell Crawford slowly looked down at himself, then up at her. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and for the first time that morning, every single employee lifted their head to watch. No one dared breathe, because everyone knew what usually happened next. The clash in the lobby. The entire lobby felt like a stage where time had frozen. Employees who normally kept their eyes glued to the floor were now staring openly, unable to look away from the sight of Maxwell Crawford standing with coffee dripping down his suit. The stain spread quickly, soaking into the fine fabric. His hands clenched at his sides, and his jaw tightened like a man trying to hold back a storm. The silence was so sharp that even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than usual. No one spoke. No one dared to move. Riley's stomach twisted with dread. She wanted to melt into the floor, to disappear before the CEO's wrath landed on her. Every story she had overheard about him flashed through her mind. The assistant he fired for a single typo, the manager who lost his position for being 5 minutes late, the rumor of an executive who cried after a private meeting with him and never returned. She was the new girl, barely an hour into her first day, and already she had committed the ultimate sin, humiliating Maxwell Crawford in front of his empire. Maxwell's gaze fixed on her with the weight of a predator studying prey. He didn't shout, not yet. His voice, when it finally came, was low, but carried through the room like a blade sliding from its sheath. "Do you have any idea," he said slowly, "what you've just done?" The receptionist behind the desk flinched. A man standing by the elevator shifted nervously, his briefcase pressed tightly against his chest. Everyone braced for the explosion, but Riley, trembling though she was, took a deep breath. Her cheeks burned with shame, yet something inside her told her that if she bowed her head and apologized weakly like everyone else, she would be finished before she even began. She swallowed, her voice shaking but audible. "Yes," she said, surprising herself. "I spilled coffee on you." Ripplum Tarikaris. Shock passed through the lobby. No one ever spoke to Maxwell Crawford so plainly. Most people stumbled over apologies, desperate to soften his fury, but Riley's words carried an odd sort of honesty, almost defiance. Maxwell's eyes narrowed, and he took a single step closer. He was taller than she imagined, his presence towering over her, pressing down like gravity itself. Yet Riley forced herself to keep her chin up. I'll pay for the cleaning, she added quickly, her voice steadier now. Or I'll buy you another suit. But I won't run away from my mistake. It was an accident, and I'm sorry. Truly sorry. But it's not the end of the world. The last sentence slipped out before she could stop it. The end of the world. In this office, that was exactly how people described angering Maxwell Crawford. The moment the words left her mouth, a few gasps escaped from the watching crowd. The receptionist covered her lips, her eyes darting between Riley and Maxwell as if expecting thunder to strike at any second. Maxwell stared at Riley for a long, unbearable moment. His silence was worse than yelling. He studied her face as if trying to decide whether she was brave or simply foolish. Finally, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and dabbed at the stains on his shirt. His hand was steady, but his eyes never left hers. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice quiet but heavy with menace. Riley shook her head quickly. "No, sir, not funny, just human." The words hung in the air like a spark over dry wood. They were simple, but they carried weight. Human. It was not a word that anyone ever used with Maxwell Crawford. To his employees, he was more like a machine, cold, efficient, merciless. And here was this new secretary, this clumsy stranger, reminding him and everyone else that he was, in fact, only human. A murmur stirred among the employees. It was faint, but it spread like a wave. For the first time, Maxwell didn't have the upper hand in the way people expected. His authority, though not broken, had been shaken. The moment was fragile, balanced on the edge of his next decision. Would he crush her in front of everyone and restore his iron reputation? Or would he do something no one believed him capable of, show restraint? Maxwell inhaled sharply, folding the stained handkerchief back into his pocket. His voice when he spoke again was icy but restrained. "My office, now." He turned on his heel and strode toward the elevator, the click of his shoes echoing across the marble floor. The crowd slowly exhaled, as if they had all been holding their breath at once. Heads turned toward Riley, eyes wide, expressions a mix of pity and admiration. Some silently prayed for her career, certain she would not last the day. Others, however, felt a strange spark of hope, though they would never admit it aloud. Riley bent down to pick up the empty coffee cups, her hands shaking. But as she followed Maxwell toward the elevator, her mind cleared. She had survived the first strike. She didn't know what awaited her behind his office doors, but one thing was certain. She had already done what no one else dared to do. She had stood her ground, and Maxwell Crawford had noticed. Behind closed doors, the elevator ride to the top floor felt endless, though in reality it lasted less than a minute. Riley stood behind Maxwell, her heart pounding so hard she feared he might hear it. He didn't look at her, didn't speak. His broad shoulders filled the space, his reflection in the polished metal walls staring back at her like a warning. The silence between them was suffocating, and she gripped the tray of empty cups as if it were a lifeline. When the doors opened, she followed him into a hallway lined with dark wood paneling and muted paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. The floor was so clean it gleamed like a mirror. Everything about the place screamed power and money, yet it was cold, devoid of warmth, of life. It reminded Riley of the man walking in front of her, polished, imposing, intimidating, but strangely hollow. Maxwell pushed open the heavy double doors to his office, and Riley stepped into a space that felt less like a workplace and more like a throne room. A wall of glass overlooked the city, the skyscrapers below dwarfed by the height of this tower. Behind a massive desk carved from mahogany sat leather chairs that seemed too stiff to be comfortable. Bookshelves lined one wall, but the spines of the books looked untouched, as if they were decorations rather than sources of knowledge. The room was immaculate but sterile, as if even dust was afraid to settle here. Maxwell strode to his desk, removed his jacket, and placed it neatly on the back of his chair. The coffee stain across his shirt was a glaring reminder of what had just happened, and Riley braced herself for the storm. She had heard that when Maxwell unleashed his anger in private, it was worse than anything seen in public. People left his office broken, their confidence shattered, their careers destroyed with a few words. He turned to her at last, his gaze sharp enough to pierce through her. "Do you know," he began, his tone clipped, How many people have stood where you are now and walked out unemployed? Riley's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. Probably more than I can count, she said softly. But I'm not like them. For the briefest second, something flickered across his face, a twitch of surprise, perhaps even curiosity. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold mask he wore so well. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. Not like them? You think you're special? You think clumsy accidents and bold words make you different? Riley drew a shaky breath. Every instinct told her to apologize again, to beg for forgiveness, but she resisted. She had seen the fear in the lobby, the way everyone looked at Maxwell as if he were a monster who could devour them whole. And for the first time she realized that maybe his power wasn't as solid as it appeared. Maybe it depended on everyone's willingness to bow their heads. If she gave in, she would become just another broken employee in his empire. If she stood firm, she might discover the truth behind the man they all feared. I don't think I'm special, she said carefully. But I do think you've built a place where everyone is too scared to breathe. That's not strength. That's loneliness. The words slipped out before she could stop them, but once they were spoken, she didn't regret them. Maxwell's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. He turned away from her, pacing toward the window. His silhouette against the skyline was striking, like a king surveying his kingdom. Yet as Riley watched him, she saw the faintest slump in his shoulders, the weight of something invisible pressing down on him. Loneliness, he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. Then he laughed, but it was hollow, bitter. What would you know about that? You've been here for less than a day. I know what it looks like, Riley replied quietly. Because I've felt it too. Silence filled the room. Maxwell stopped pacing, his back still to her. For a long moment, Riley thought he might order her out, or worse, fire her on the spot. But instead, he stood motionless, staring out at the city as if her words had unsettled something deep inside him. Riley's nerves buzzed with both fear and strange confidence. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she sensed she had touched a nerve, pierced a part of him no one else dared to reach. She wasn't sure if that would salve her or doom her, but she knew one thing. This was not just about spilled coffee anymore. Something far more complicated was happening. At last, Maxwell turned back to her, his face composed but his eyes sharper than before. You're either the bravest or the stupidest secretary I've ever had, he said. But one thing is certain. You've just made yourself unforgettable. Riley held his gaze, refusing to flinch. She didn't know what kind of game she had stepped into, but she could feel the balance shifting. She was no longer just the girl who spilled coffee. She was the secretary who had dared to call out the humanity in the most feared CEO in the city. And that, she realized, was exactly why he couldn't simply dismiss her. The cracks in the armor, Riley sat in one of the stiff leather chairs across from Maxwell's desk, her palms pressed tightly together in her lap. The office was so quiet that she could hear the faint tick of a clock on the bookshelf. Maxwell had not spoken again since declaring her unforgettable, and the silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. He moved with deliberate calm, taking a fresh shirt from a sleek cabinet and disappearing into the adjoining restroom. Riley's thoughts spun in the quiet. She had expected rage, maybe even the humiliation of being thrown out on her very first day. Yet instead, she found herself sitting in his private office, waiting for what came next. When Maxwell returned, his shirt crisp and clean once more, his expression had hardened again. He sat behind the desk and studied her, his elbows resting on the polished wood, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. It was the look of a man who dissected problems, broke them apart piece by piece until they revealed their weaknesses. Riley had no doubt he was doing the same to her now. You think you've seen me, he said finally, his tone controlled, almost clinical. But you haven't. What you saw downstairs was a moment, a mistake. Do not confuse it with an invitation to analyze me. Riley leaned forward slightly, her nerves jangling, but her voice remained steady. With respect, sir, you don't need an invitation. Everyone in this building analyzes you already. They live in fear of what you'll say, what you'll do. You control them with silence, with threats. But what I saw just now wasn't power. It was pain. Maxwell's eyes flashed, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a humorless smile tugging at his lips. You're bold. I'll give you that. Most people last 3 minutes in this office before they crumble, and yet here you are diagnosing me as if you were some kind of therapist. He chuckled once, low and sharp. Tell me, Riley, what do you think you've discovered? What great truth do you imagine lies behind the monster everyone fears? The question was meant to intimidate, but Riley recognized it for what it was, a test. She took a slow breath before answering. I think you hide behind this reputation because it's easier than trusting people. If everyone fears you, then no one can betray you. For the first time, Maxwell's composure cracked. His smile faltered, and a shadow crossed his eyes. He looked away, drumming his fingers lightly on the desk, a rare sign of unease. Riley had touched something raw, something he didn't want exposed. The air in the room shifted as if the walls themselves sensed the tension. You presume too much, Maxwell said, his voice quieter now, almost guarded. Fear is not weakness, it is control. And control is the only thing that keeps this empire from collapsing. Riley frowned, studying him. Maybe. But control built on fear doesn't last. People break under it. They obey you, yes, but they don't respect you. And when fear is the only bond you have with the people around you, you end up alone. The word alone hung in the air again, sharper than before. Maxwell's jaw tightened and he rose, abruptly from his chair, pacing toward the window. He placed both hands on the glass as he stared out over the sprawling city below. From behind, he looked untouchable, a titan surveying his kingdom. But to Riley, he seemed smaller now, not in stature but in spirit. She could almost see the weight pressing down on his shoulders, the invisible chains of his own making. For several long moments, he said nothing. Riley wondered if she had gone too far, if she had stepped into territory that no one was meant to enter. But then Maxwell spoke, his tone stripped of the icy sharpness it usually carried. Do you know what it's like, he said slowly, to build something from nothing? To claw your way to the top with your bare hands, only to realize that the higher you climb, the fewer people you can trust? Everyone wants something. Everyone is waiting for you to fall so they can take your place. Fear. It's the only currency that never betrays you. Riley listened intently. For the first time, he was not a tyrant, not the untouchable CEO, but a man confessing the logic behind his cruelty. It didn't excuse his actions, but it explained them. She could sense the bitterness, the exhaustion, the cost of living in a fortress of his own design. You built walls so high, she said gently, that now no one can reach you, even the people who might actually care. Maxwell turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing again, but the sharpness was dulled by something else. Perhaps regret, perhaps sorrow. He studied her in silence as though trying to decide whether she was naive or dangerously perceptive. Finally, he sighed, returning to his chair. You should be careful, Riley. People who try to reach me often regret it. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. Then maybe I'll be the exception. For a moment, their eyes locked and the room seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Maxwell broke it first, pulling a folder from his desk and tossing it lightly across to her. You want to prove you're different? Fine. Here's your first task. Review this, organize the schedule, and don't make a single mistake. If you succeed, you'll keep this job. If you fail... He let the sentence hang, unfinished, but its meaning was clear. Riley picked up the folder, feeling its weight in her hands. She nodded firmly. I won't fail. Maxwell leaned back, watching her with an expression that was hard to read. For the first time, Riley felt that the man behind the reputation, the one hidden under all the layers of power and fear, was watching her too. And though she didn't know what this fragile connection meant yet, she sensed it was only the beginning of something that could change them both. The secretary who wouldn't break. The thick folder sat on Riley's desk like a silent test, its edges sharp, its contents heavier than paper should have felt. She had spent the rest of the morning in Maxwell's outer office, sorting through schedules, contracts, memos, and endless details that others before her had apparently failed to organize to his impossible standards. At first glance, it looked overwhelming, a puzzle designed to break anyone's patience. The former secretary's hasty notes and crossed-out mistakes made it even worse. Yet Riley refused to be intimidated. She saw the task for what it was. Maxwell's way of testing her resolve, of measuring whether she was just another timid assistant who would crumble under pressure. The hours ticked by in silence, except for the shuffle of papers and the rhythmic tapping of her pen. Now and then she caught sight of employees passing by the glass wall of Maxwell's office. Their eyes would flicker toward her desk, curiosity hidden beneath expressive ions of fear. She knew what they were thinking. Poor girl, she won't last the week, maybe not even the day. Riley almost laughed to herself. They had no idea how stubborn she could be. She wasn't here to be swallowed by fear. She was here to prove, if only to herself, that she could stand tall even in a place where others bent. By mid-afternoon, she had not only organized the folder but also restructured the schedule in a way that actually made sense. She noticed meetings that overlapped unnecessarily, contracts that had been scheduled for review twice, and entire time slots wasted on repetitive reports. With careful precision, she created a new system, color-coded and prioritized for efficiency. It wasn't just about getting the task done. It was about showing Maxwell that she was not afraid to improve what everyone else simply obeyed. The test of her work came sooner than expected. Maxwell strode out of his office just as Riley finished compiling the schedule. The entire hallway seemed to stiffen when he appeared, employees ducking their heads, pretending to be busy. His presence was like gravity, inescapable. He stopped at her desk, his eyes falling on the folder. "Finished?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Yes," Riley replied evenly, meeting his gaze, "and I made adjustments to increase efficiency." She handed him the revised schedule, her fingers steady despite the fact that every nerve in her body screamed at her to tread carefully. Maxwell flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. For several tense moments, the only sound was the rustle of paper as he examined her work. Riley braced herself for criticism, for the inevitable scoff or biting remark. But instead, Maxwell closed the folder and set it back on her desk. His voice, when he spoke, carried no praise, but neither did it carry the expected disdain. "You'll sit in on the afternoon board meeting. Bring this with you." The word stunned her. Assistants didn't sit in on board meetings. They delivered coffee, took notes, maybe waited outside for scraps of orders. Maxwell's decision was unheard of, and when Riley followed him into the sleek conference room minutes later, she felt the heat of every pair of eyes in the room. The board members, powerful men and women in expensive suits, looked at her with barely concealed surprise. Some looked annoyed, others curious, but all of them knew one thing. If Maxwell had allowed this, it meant something. The meeting began, and Riley sat quietly at the side of the long table, her folder in front of her, her hands folded. She listened as executives presented numbers, reports, and strategies. She saw the fear ripple even here, at the highest level of the company. Every presentation was cautious, every word chosen to avoid provoking Maxwell. And yet, despite their polished delivery, Riley noticed mistakes, missed opportunities, inefficient plans, details they glossed over because they were too afraid to suggest something bold. Halfway through, Maxwell called for the updated schedule. Riley handed it to him, and as he scanned the pages, one of the executives frowned. "This isn't the format we've used before," the man said, his tone edged with disapproval. Riley's chest tightened, but before she could respond, Maxwell spoke, his voice sharp enough to cut. "It's better." The executive fell silent, clearly shocked, while the rest of the table exchanged quick glances. Riley kept her expression neutral, but inside, her heart leaped. Maxwell had defended her. Not warmly, not kindly, but decisively. In that single moment, she felt a shift. The secretary who had been expected to fail was suddenly the woman whose work the feared CEO had endorsed in front of his most powerful allies. The meeting continued, and Riley remained silent, but she knew every eye, and the room had turned toward her at least once. By the time it ended, whispers followed her as she gathered her notes. People who had dismissed her hours ago now looked at her differently, some with resentment, some with curiosity, but none with indifference. When the boardroom emptied, Maxwell lingered by the window, staring out at the skyline. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "Most people crumble under pressure," he said. "You didn't." Riley stood straighter, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to crumble, Mr. Crawford." Finally, he turned, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, she thought she saw the faintest trace of something new in his expression. Not just calculation, but respect. It was fleeting, quickly hidden behind his mask of control, but it was there nonetheless. As Riley left the room, she felt the weight of 100 invisible eyes on her back. The whispers would spread, the story of the secretary who spilled coffee on Maxwell Crawford and lived to tell about it, who not only survived his test, but earned a place at the table. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. The cracks in the armor of the feared CEO were growing wider, and somehow she had become the hammer striking them open. Whispers in the shadows. By the next morning, the atmosphere inside Crawford Enterprises was different. Employees who once walked with their eyes fixed to the floor now glanced up when Riley passed by. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief and wonder, as if they couldn't quite decide whether she was foolish or extraordinary. After all, no one had ever survived embarrassing Maxwell Crawford, let alone earned his grudging respect afterward. And now, after the board meeting, whispers spread like wildfire. The new secretary was not like the others. She had done what no one else had dared, stood her ground. Riley felt the weight of those whispers every time she stepped into the hallway. Some employees smiled faintly when she caught their eye, as if silently cheering her on, while others looked at her with suspicion, their loyalty to fear too ingrained to welcome change. Still, the shift was undeniable. For the first time, Maxwell's iron grip on the company showed signs of bending. But not everyone welcomed the change. In the break room, two senior managers muttered in hushed tones, their voices carrying just far enough for Riley to overhear as she poured herself a glass of water. "She won't last," one said bitterly. "Crawford's only keeping her around to see how far she dares to go before he crushes her." "Maybe," the other replied, "but you saw what happened yesterday. He defended her work in front of the board. He's never done that for anyone. It's dangerous. If she starts changing things, the whole system could unravel." Riley walked away without a word, but their conversation stayed with her. They weren't entirely wrong. She was challenging a system built on fear, and systems like that never crumbled without a fight. But what they didn't understand was that she wasn't trying to rebel or take power. All she wanted was to bring humanity back into a place that had lost it. Later that day, Maxwell summoned her into his office again. He was seated behind his desk, but this time his posture seemed less rigid, his gaze less cold. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Riley obeyed, her heart steady but alert. She knew by now that every conversation with Maxwell was a battle of wills, even if it wasn't spoken aloud. "You've caused a stir," Maxwell said simply, his voice measured. "The board is talking. The employees are talking. Even the managers are whispering about you." "Let them talk," Riley replied. "If they're talking, it means they're not afraid in that moment. That's already progress." His lips pressed into a thin line as though he disapproved of her boldness, but his eyes betrayed something else, interest. He leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "You think fear is a poison," he said, "but fear built this company. Fear made people perform. Fear kept the leeches and traitors at bay." Riley tilted her head slightly. "Fear might build walls, Mr. Crawford, but walls don't last forever. They crack, and when they fall, they bury the very people who built them." Her words hung in the air, and for once, Maxwell didn't immediately counter them. Instead, he turned his chair toward the window, staring out at the skyline as though the city itself might provide an answer. His reflection in the glass looked tired, older than the powerful figure he projected to the world. Riley studied him silently, realizing that beneath his iron exterior lived a man who had sacrificed more than he ever admitted. After a long pause, Maxwell spoke, his tone quieter than she had ever heard. "Do you know why people fear me, Riley? It isn't because I'm cruel. It's because I'm predictable. They know that mistakes have consequences. They know I will never forgive weakness. What they don't know is that I once trusted someone who nearly destroyed me. That was the first and last time I made the mistake of believing in loyalty. The confession startled her. It was more than she expected, and it explained more than he realized. He wasn't just cold for the sake of control, he was cold because of betrayal. She wanted to ask who had hurt him so deeply, but she sensed it was not a question he would answer. Instead, she said softly, "You built a fortress to protect yourself. But even fortresses are prisons if you never leave them." Maxwell turned his head sharply, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, anger flashed, but it wasn't directed at her. It was directed inward, at the truth he couldn't ignore. His fingers drummed against the desk, his only outward sign of discomfort. Then, to her surprise, he leaned forward and asked, "Tell me, Riley, why are you really here? What made you walk into the lion's den knowing the stories, knowing what people say about me?" The question caught her off guard, but she answered honestly, "Because I needed this job, but also because I don't believe the stories people tell. Everyone deserves a chance to prove they're more than their reputation, even you." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. For the first time, Riley felt as though the invisible wall between them had thinned, even if only slightly. Maxwell didn't smile, didn't soften, but he also didn't dismiss her. Instead, he leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Be careful, Riley," he said at last. "Believing in people is the fastest way to get hurt, and you may find that I'm not the man you think I am." Riley met his eyes steadily. "Maybe, but you may also find that you're not the man you think you are either." Maxwell said nothing, but the faintest flicker of something, curiosity, maybe even doubt, crossed his face before he masked it again. As Riley returned to her desk, she knew she had just stepped deeper into dangerous territory. Maxwell had revealed more than he intended, and she had further than anyone before her. The company watched her closely now, and whispers would only grow louder. Yet Riley felt no fear. Instead, she felt a strange certainty that she was unraveling something much bigger than spilled coffee or boardroom schedules. She was uncovering the truth of a man who had built an empire on fear, and for the first time, the empire itself was beginning to tremble. The unmasking of Maxwell Crawford. The following week unfolded with a quiet tension that seemed to coil itself around every corner of Crawford Enterprises. Employees watched Riley with wide eyes whenever she passed, whispering in hushed voices about the secretary who dared to speak to Maxwell Crawford like no one else ever had. Some whispered that she was playing with fire, that soon she would burn. Others, secretly hopeful, wondered if she was the one who might finally break through the walls of fear that had dominated their lives for years. Riley, for her part, worked steadily. She answered calls, sorted documents, and kept Maxwell's schedule with precision. Yet beneath the rhythm of her daily tasks, she remained alert, sensing that something larger was building. Maxwell had grown strangely unpredictable. He was still sharp and demanding, but there were moments when his mask slipped. Moments when he lingered in silence after she spoke, moments when he seemed on the verge of saying something but stopped himself. It was as if her presence had unsettled a balance he had carefully maintained for years. The storm finally broke during a Friday afternoon board meeting. The air inside the conference room was thick with tension. Several executives had grown restless with Maxwell's leadership, though none dared to confront him directly. But that day, a man named Gregory Stanton, one of the longest-serving board members, pushed forward an agenda that revealed the cracks beneath the empire. He presented documents that called Maxwell's decisions into question, accusing him of reckless strategies and of isolating the company from valuable partnerships. The storm finally broke during a Friday afternoon board meeting. The air inside the conference room was thick with tension. Several executives had grown restless with Maxwell's leadership, though none dared to confront him directly. But that day, a man named Gregory Stanton, one of the longest-serving board members, pushed forward an agenda that revealed the cracks beneath the empire. He presented documents that called Maxwell's decisions into question, accusing him of reckless strategies and of isolating the company from valuable partnerships. At first, the room went still, every eye flicking toward Maxwell. His face was calm, his voice level as he dissected Stanton's claims one by one, dismantling them with facts. But Riley, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, noticed something no one else did, the flash of betrayal in Maxwell's eyes. She saw the faint tightening of his jaw, the same look he had when he admitted once, in private, that he had been betrayed before. This was not just business, this was personal. And then Stanton made the mistake that changed everything. He smirked and said, "Funny, isn't it, Maxwell? History repeating itself. One betrayal wasn't enough to teach you?" The words detonated like a bomb in the room. The executives froze, their gazes snapping between the two men. Stanton had gone too far. He had touched a wound most didn't even know existed. Riley felt the weight of Maxwell's silence before he spoke, and she knew in her bones that this was the ghost from his past, the betrayal that had forged the man he had become. Maxwell's eyes turned cold, his voice cutting through the air like steel. "Be careful, Stanton. You don't know what you're talking about." But Stanton leaned forward, his tone mocking. "Oh, I think I do. We all know about Charles Whitaker, about how he built half this company with you and then walked away, taking your truce and half your clients with him. That's why you've turned yourself into a fortress, Crawford. That's why you lead with fear, because you're terrified it could happen again." The silence was deafening. Gasps broke out around the table. Even Riley's breath caught in her throat. So this was the truth. The origin of Maxwell's cruelty. Years ago, he had been betrayed by the man he trusted most, his closest partner, someone he had built his empire with. And instead of healing, he had turned that wound into armor, hardening himself until no one could ever get close again. Maxwell rose slowly from his chair, his presence filling the room. His voice was low, but every syllable carried weight. "You dare bring his name into this boardroom?" His hands tightened on the edge of the table, his knuckles pale. "You think betrayal makes me weak? You think reminding me of it diminishes me? That betrayal is the reason this company still stands, because I learned never to trust, never to let weakness in." The room remained silent, but Riley knew this was her moment. She could let the old Maxwell reassert himself, restoring his reign of fear, or she could strike at the heart of the truth he had just unwillingly revealed. She stood slowly, her voice calm but firm. "And yet, here you are, still carrying his shadow," she said. "You may have built walls, Mr. Crawford, but walls don't erase wounds. They only keep them festering inside. You don't need more fear to protect this company. You need to finally let go of the betrayal that made you this way." The executives stared at her in shock. No one spoke to Maxwell like that, but Maxwell didn't silence her. His eyes were locked on her, blazing with fury and something else, pain. For a long, unbearable moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then his shoulders dropped slightly and the fire in his gaze dimmed. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice almost breaking. "Trust cost me everything once." Riley took a step closer. "Maybe. But fear is costing you everything now. Look around you, Maxwell. They don't admire you. They don't respect you. They only obey you because they're afraid. Is that really the legacy you want to leave behind?" Her words pierced the silence like an arrow. The board members shifted uncomfortably, some glancing down, others meeting Maxwell's eyes with expressions that revealed she was right. For the first time, Maxwell seemed to truly see it, the hollow obedience, the absence of genuine loyalty. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He closed his eyes briefly, then exhaled, as though releasing a burden he had carried too long. When he opened them again, his gaze was steadier, though tinged with exhaustion. "Meeting adjourned," he said finally. His voice no longer rang with iron. It was simply a man's voice, weary and human. The executives filed out, whispering furiously among themselves. Riley remained behind, watching Maxwell as he sat back down, his hands resting heavily on the table. For the first time since she had met him, he looked less like a tyrant and more like a man stripped of his armor. "You shouldn't have done that," he murmured, not looking at her. "You shouldn't have exposed me like that in front of them." Riley walked closer, her tone gentle. "I didn't expose you. I reminded you. There's a difference. And maybe it's not too late to be more than the man fear built." Maxwell finally looked at her, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't quite name, respect, curiosity. perhaps even hope. He didn't thank her, he wasn't ready for that, but he also didn't dismiss her. And in that silence between them, Riley knew that the change had already begun. The feared millionaire CEO had been unmasked, not by power, but by rebellion, but by the courage of a secretary who dared to see the man behind the armor. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Nothing at Crawford Enterprises would ever be the same again.